who has a question or thought to share with Martin in the group? Okay, so I see William, I see Stephen immediately. So Stephen, I saw your hand first, so go for it, and then I'll call on William.
Oh, okay. Martin, thanks for a very entertaining discussion. Quite enjoyed it, obviously, and I have visions of Flashman wrapped in the Union Jack
exactly
at the collapsed fort in Afghanistan and all that good sort of stuff. Back to Lusitania, do you think it was the intent of Churchill and or the establishment that it was sunk as a means of bringing the U.S. into the war?
Yes, definitely.
Okay.
And just to show that once in a while I'm capable of giving an answer that isn't 2 hours long.
Yeah, it definitely reminded me of the story you told me of Pearl Harbor and how the British had captured intelligence that Pearl Harbor was going to unfold when it did, and chose to not share it with their American counterparts in order to get a certain effect.
Yes, if I can just take advantage of this is a book that came out 30 years ago, and it should still be available. It's called Betrayal at Pearl Harbor, I believe is the correct title. And I don't have the authors to have, but I can dig them out. But one of the authors was one of the Royal Australian Navy officers in Singapore who had broken the Japanese NS-25 naval code and sent it to the Admiralty to London. And these officers, again, like you were saying, Matt, and Anton's caution last week, so true. These were honorable men. And they took it for granted that the warning would be passed on to Washington. And they spent literally decades wondering why it hadn't been, and they simply assumed it had been bureaucratic incompetence. It was nothing of the sort. Churchill deliberately invited John Winans, the American ambassador to London, and a very naive admirer of his, to Chequers, to the British Prime Minister's weekend residence that weekend, because he wanted him to be there when the attack on Pearl Harbor came. And he insisted on the radio being brought into dinner at 9 p.m. so that they could hear the 9 o'clock BBC News announcing the attack on Pearl Harbor. And Churchill was actually completely upset and thrown for a loss when the attack wasn't announced, because, of course, given the problems with communications then, the news had gone halfway around the world from Pearl Harbor to Washington, and then a lot of things had to happen in Washington before the BBC could pick it up and broadcast it back in London. But Churchill was at first nonplussed because he expected the attack. And of course, also, he did not expect 3,000 Americans to die in that attack because he was a racist. He thought the Japanese were bungling idiots who could not, and it was impossible anyway, to sink battleships from the air. And he went through World War II still convinced of this view.
Dr. Warwick.
Okay, yes, I have some quick things to clear up. One, on Lusitania, what it contained was gun cotton. And gun cotton explodes on contact with seawater. It's used in I guess, gunpowder for artillery, but that's what happened. There's a guy named James Perloff, PERLOFF.com. He has a great lecture on that. It's very good. So that's why the Lusitania went down. And also, there was an ad in the New York Times, one of the New York Post papers, and there were posters put up that the Lusitania could possibly come under attack. And so he has a great story on that. Then there's 2 books I want to mention, and people who, 2 guys who wrote them was James McDermott, he's an MD, and Jerry Doherty, who was a historian too. They wrote 2 books, one called Hidden History and about World War I, and then another called Prolonging the Agony, which was about Gallipoli and why it was a disaster and what happened.
Yes.
2 great books, but in Hidden History, he mentions 2 things. One about Brussels. Hoover was in charge of the Brussels, I guess
Oh, that's right.
Their he was supposed to supply the food, but he was working both sides, and he was a complete fraud, and he did not help the French. He did more to help the Germans than he did to help the French. And it's a great, great book. I highly recommend it.
Thank you.
Prolonging the agony about Gallipoli was just, that was just so horrible. It was unbelievable. And then if you want to see a great film about the gas wars in World War I, there's a great movie called The Legend of Bagger Vance. It's a golf story and a spiritual story.
The Australian movie? Yes, that's wonderful.
American.
Oh, then I don't know it.
I think it's Jack Lemmon that's in it. He's the guy who tried for 40 years to get to meet the cut in Pebble Beach, and he missed every time. And he made this movie. It's a great, great movie, and it's about how he grew up and met this guy named Bagger Vance. And it turns out Bagger wasn't a guy, he was a spirit.
Cool.
It's about this guy who was a golfer in Georgia who got post-traumatic stress disorder in World War I, especially from the gas attacks. So it's a great, great movie. I highly recommend it. Highly recommend it. Legend of Bagger Vance, Jack Lemmon. And the other guy is Will Smith. He plays this spirit.
Oh, yes, the golf movie.
That great golf movie. If you love
Oh, it's
golf,
wonderful. Sorry, I was thinking in other terms about a different life. That's a wonderful movie.
even if you don't
Yes,
play
bless
golf,
you.
I love it. So,
I love that
and then there
movie.
was one more thing on in Germany. The Germans had this ironworks. It was really in France or on the border of France, and the French and the British and nobody ever attacked it. It just sat there. So Germany got their iron without any problems, even though they had this ironworks that was like a sitting duck to be blown up or to be shelled. And it's about how it talks a lot about Churchill. It talks about Cecil Rhodes and the formation of the Cecil Rhodes, Milner, kindergarten and that whole thing, and how Roosevelt, not Roosevelt, but Churchill lied. He wrote this fictional story about how he escaped from the Boers.
Oh,
Complete piece of fiction.
yes, he was good.
Really is down on
Just quick, Bill, and then we'll have to move on to another question. What's the name of that story that you're referencing just now?
the two history books. Yeah.
Yeah, what is it called? Just give me the name, or give us the name.
Hidden History by James McDermott,
Get
and Jerry Doherty, and then Prolonging the Agony, which was the sequel.
okay. Thank you.
That's about the
I actually have that book and I'm holding it up, Matt.
Ah, there you go. Small world. Okay. All right. I'll check that out. I think that sounds like an interesting premise. Yeah, Marty, do you have anything you want to say to that, or do I move on to the next question?
Well, I'll try and make it brief. First, full agreement and appreciation with everything you said. It's so helpful and so startling. And again, you touch a nerve with me in a positive way when you bring up the whole Gallipoli business, because I revered Churchill growing up. Revered him. Friends joked at me, made fun of me about it. And that was not uncommon for the kids who were studying history or going on in academic work in my generation. We revered Churchill. And Churchill's statue as a demigod, of course, has only, again, risen in Britain ever since then. Boris Johnson has written a biography of Churchill. And it's actually a worthwhile book because he's a much better biographer than he is a politician or a prime minister. He's terrible at all those things, but the book is worth reading. But in terms of Gallipoli, that was what started my road to enlightenment. Because I traveled a lot to Istanbul in my life and in my career. And I was finally in the 90s on one trip for UPI. And I had relatively unlimited, in those amazing days, I had relatively free time and even more amazingly, a relatively generous budget. And I was able to take time off to visit the archaeology sites of Troy and the battlefields of Gallipoli. And of course, you're ahead of me again, Stephen, because they're almost exactly the same place, because it's such a key point in geography, and that applies to history in different eras, in different ways. But I had always bought into Churchill's vivid account in the world crisis of how Gallipoli could have been won, should have been won, how close we were to winning it. It was impossible from the word go. Churchill, again, who is wonderful at lying and turning history into fiction or vice versa, has this huge, thrilling account, like something out of Flashman, on the Battle of Suvla Bay. The Australians capture the top 20 times, only to be driven back by the Turks on every occasion. And if only they could have held it a few minutes more, the way to Constantinople would have been open. The war would have been over in 1915. The Russian Revolution would never have happened. All of this is what he writes, right? And I go there. I actually bother going there. Now, what's the word? The territory you're in it's like a lower version of the Rocky Mountains or the Pyrenees. You have well, you've probably been there, Stephen. You certainly clearly know exactly what I'm talking about. It's let alone with even the military technology of World War II in Italy. In World War I, without aircraft, without tanks, it was impossible to fight your way up it, let alone land on it. There weren't even any beaches such as we had at Normandy. They didn't have any tanks or armored landing carriers to protect the soldiers. The invading army came ashore in wooden boats that were rowed by hand. Churchill hadn't bothered protecting them against rifle fire, let alone anything heavier from the mainland. It was a massacre. The Australians never had a chance of getting to the top of the hill at Suvla Bay. And even if they had, what would they have found? They would have found 50 miles of even more impenetrable territory that I was exploring, going all the way up close to Constantinople itself. As a couple of the better biographers of Churchill, he was in the cavalry at Sandhurst in World War I. He never all his life looked at a relief map. He never realized when invading Italy that there are mountains in Italy and they slow you down. At the end of the war, and even in the world crisis, he's saying how we could have won the war not by invading southern France, but by invading through the Alps. Going up through the Alps and taking Vienna ahead of the Russians by invading through the Alps. And there was a very, very fine, you may remember him, Stephen, he was the editor of the Ballantine books in America and Canada, Ballantine battle books, Barry Pitt. And he also was the editor of Purnell's History of the Second World War magazine back in the 1960s. And he wrote some very fine histories of aspects of World War I and World War II himself. He only died a few years ago at the age of 89. He had a wonderful life, I'm allowed to say, the kind of man who always wore a bow tie and made it look stylish, you know? But Barry Pitt comments on this back in the 1960s on Churchill's plan to win World War II by invading through the Alpine passes, which nobody had got through since Hannibal, right? Yeah. And he says, well, I have one question for Mr. Churchill. How? Exactly. So again, thank you for all those comments, and the Gallipoli ones are so on the ball, so utterly on the ball.
All battles are won based on geography.
Yes, exactly.
Geography, or who holds it, they win the battle and the war.
We have two questions coming up, one from Cynthia and a comment and question from Jim. So Cynthia, go for it. You have to take yourself off mute.
Yep. Yeah, thank you, Martin. That was a really great class as usual. Your knowledge on history is just unmatched. It's quite impressive.
But not unmatched when you and Matt are around, Cynthia.
Oh, right. That. Okay, and you're a first-class flatterer too. I have a question for you. You bring up the point, with McKinley's assassination and Teddy Roosevelt coming in, and there's this rapid regression. And the fact that Elliot Roosevelt brings up the point in his recounting of his interactions with Franklin, that Franklin complained that this is more like the British Foreign Office that he's surrounded with. in his American administration. I would like to ask you, was it Teddy who was responsible for a lot of that influx of support for the perspective on from the British intelligence outlook?
I stand to be corrected by other people here. Anton and Stephen may well know much more about this than I do, this particular aspect. I do not believe so, but it was true indirectly. What first of all, you're entirely correct, of course, about FDR's healthy disdain and distrust of the State Department. His de facto real Secretary of State was the Deputy Secretary of State, Sumner Welles, who he's forced by a cheap intrigue by Ambassador Bill Bullitt to drop in 1942. And it is Welles who is really FDR's strong right arm in diplomacy. He doesn't trust the State Department at all. Mm-hmm. And the State Department is very, very Anglophile. Mm-hmm. And also they can't see the wood for the trees. When FDR makes Davis his ambassador to Moscow, again, another case like William Jennings Bryan or President Trump, of a man who is assailed shamefully and relentlessly as a buffoon and a criminal. Max Hastings, for example, a British historian, makes him out to be worse than a Nazi. But Davis is hugely important for establishing communications of trust between FDR and Joseph Stalin that mm-hmm. proved to be of the highest importance when we enter World War II. Mm-hmm. And FDR rightly uses them as a direct connection then. And even then, Davis is systematically opposed and undermined by what he and the president agree is the striped pants brigade, the arrogant professional diplomats. Now, the thing is, as I said, the effect is indirect. These are all people who are from East Coast elitist backgrounds, like Teddy Roosevelt. Many of them will have been highly influenced by, the older of them will be influenced by Roosevelt before World War I. So there is a strong indirect influence there, strong indirect influence. But I stress that, at least in some, I stand to be corrected on this and to be educated, but I have not found anything more direct than that. What you do have, of course, is this intimate friendship between Cecil Spring Rice, who is one of the 2 or 3 closest friends that Theodore Roosevelt has in his entire life to his death. And Rice becomes the US ambassador to Washington, not under TR, but during World War I. And as a matter of record, he is at the center of the relentless and hugely successful efforts. I mean, if the standards which have been used, and this is something Jim, like myself, even more than I, has been looking at closely. If you look at all the lies of Russiagate, all the lies of collusion, all of which were entirely false and have been proven by veteran, honorable American most senior diplomats, most senior FBI and CIA officials, honorable men and women, many of whom I've been privileged to know personally, and they have repeatedly gone on the record as pointing out, these are all lies, fabrications, there is no evidence for any of this, right? But when you contrast that, if you apply the standards we tried to apply against Russia over the past 4 years, we should have declared war on Britain in 1915, not on Germany, because of the relentless British efforts to pull us into the war, which led directly to the death of hundreds of American men, women, and children, directly on the Lusitania, and in other ways too. Another classic example at the time was the claim of German war crimes in Belgium. Women repeatedly having their breasts cut off, which tells you a lot about the particular kinds of lurid imaginations that paid British hacks for the Secret Service and the British government liked to imagine at the time. Mm-hmm. Mass rapes, mass exterminations. The irony was this was the way the Wehrmacht and the SS operated in World War II. But it was not the way the German army operated anywhere in World War I. They were all lies. The great Irish humanitarian, a veteran of the British Foreign Service who had been knighted by King George V, Sir Roger Casement, the man who ended the genocide perpetrated by Belgium, looked into all these claims and concluded at the end of 1914 there was not a word of truth to any of them. And this, of course, in turn made poor Casement a prime target for British disinformation. And they eventually hanged him for treason on a completely trumped up charge in 1916. So everything turns out to be the opposite of what it was. But in terms of direct influence of Teddy Roosevelt on the Brit, there was a vast British cultural influence before World War I on the East Coast families. They want to be more English than the English in the Northeast. And of course, there is also the huge enduring love of Britain and France among the aristocracies of the Old South. And the Old
I want
South.
to interject because you
sorry,
have,
go ahead.
and I know that Anton wants to get in on
Oh,
this
please,
at some point
absolutely.
as well. But it's because you've done work on the networks that are responsible for McKinley's assassination, because I regard McKinley's assassination as a successful coup.
Oh, I
And
agree.
I guess like who was in charge of that, because there was definitely an infiltration of some sort. And then Anton can chime in.
Cynthia, bless you. This is an extremely clear-cut picture. And I already talked on significant elements of it last time you folks had me on. And I've even been able to advance it significantly since then, because the chain of command here, as with the assassination of Tsar Alexander II 20 years earlier in Russia, is equally clear. And it's on the same key figure is running them, and there's the same key methodology of how the chain of command works. The key figure is the head of the Anarchist International, who is based in Britain and runs it as a very close, tightly fitted international organization, more tightly organized even than the Comintern operated in the 1920s and 30s, because it's much smaller. Discipline is tighter and much more ruthless and enforced. It's easy to keep a grip on it. It's run by our old friend, Prince Peter Kropotkin, the mastermind of the blowing of the legs off of the great Tsar Alexander II in 1881. Now, in 1881, he had Sophia Andreevna, his former mistress, as the operational head of the cell in St. Petersburg, who was relentless in 11 different attempts to assassinate the Tsar over a less than 2-year period. And there is, of course, as Matthew has pointed out to me, significant suspicion as to who in the imperial, in the Okhrana, the Russian Secret Service, may well have been working with the revolutionaries to get rid of the Tsar, because from their perspective, the Tsar was too liberal anyway, and they wanted Tsar Alexander, his surviving son, who was, on the other hand, a thoroughgoing reactionary, to take over. So you have the anarchists and the secret police for very different reasons, with the same goal in mind, to eliminate the same admirable and heroic figure who is in the middle. See the same picture with McKinley. But we can now take it even further than bless you, Cynthia, than I did before. Because what I discovered was, and this is actually, again, public domain stuff, there's no secret about this. When in 1901 and previously in 1898, Kropotkin visits the United States twice on behalf of the anarchist movement, and he's completely open about it. He gets protection from the British establishment very cunningly and indirectly. He appears as a representative of British biological and scientific associations to discuss evolution at major scientific meetings in New York, Boston, and Chicago, right? That's why he comes. When he is in Boston, he stays as a guest at I'm trying to remember, is it the Colonial Club? It's in my articles on this in Strategic Culture. But Peter Kropotkin stays at, it's the Colonial Club, I believe, I stand to be corrected, in Boston, right? Now think about this. The head of the leading murderous revolutionary organization in the world, which has included among its victims the Tsar of Russia, the President of France, the Prime Minister of Spain and Italy, and also had attempted to kill twice the Emperor of Germany. And only 3 years before, in 1898, had murdered the Empress Elizabeth of Austria-Hungary, who'd been stabbed to death in Geneva, right? And there was a reason why they specifically went after her, I've now discovered. He comes to America, and he is a guest of Harvard University at the most elite club in Boston and Cambridge. How did he get there? Well, actually, that's a matter of common knowledge as well. The man who puts him up for it is one of the most eminent members of the club and an eminent Boston graduate himself, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, who is the other close lifelong best friend of President Theodore Roosevelt. Now, Roosevelt is not the mastermind behind all this. It's quite the opposite. Roosevelt is very innocent and naive in many ways, and Cabot Lodge is not, which of course is one of the things that attracts Cabot Lodge to Roosevelt. He can manipulate him. But also, of course, Roosevelt is loved, and nobody except Satan himself could possibly love Henry Cabot Lodge, a very saturnine, dark, sinister son of a bitch figure, right? So you even have a close connection there. And as you say, Cynthia, they already know the vice president is going to be Teddy Roosevelt. Who forced Roosevelt on the ticket? Cabot Lodge and his friends did.
Wow.
What was the opening to put him on the ticket? Because William McKinley had a very outstandingly able and popular and responsible vice president, Vice President Hobart, who was the former governor of Ohio. Now totally forgotten, of course, nobody looks at him. He was in excellent health in his early 50s, and then he suddenly falls ill in the summer of 1898 or 1899, I think 1899, and he dies after a few months' illness that has never been identified.
It gives you an appreciation of what JFK was going against with a
yes, exactly.
Lodge, like my God.
JFK was against a hell of a lot more, because these are the Brits and a few key people of wealth and power in the East Coast establishment going against President.
I have to go. I have to go. So let me just put it in one.
Come in.
Yeah, the figure in British intelligence who came over here was named Claude Dancy, D-A-N-S-E-Y. Colonel Claude Dancy, and I wrote an article called about Hoover's FBI and the Anglo-American dictatorship. It was in EIR. It was the cause of my getting fired as a history writer by EIR, and then later on the guy that did that was kicked out. But anyway. It goes into how they incorporated the Wall Street people into the they set up a whole new intelligence community.
There's your answer.
So it's a pretty interesting story. But
Anton, is that the article where you go through Napoleon's like grandnephew who sets up the Bonaparte that sets up the
yeah, but he's not as important as Claude Dancy. Claude Dancy is the British intelligence guy who comes over here and works with the traders in the U.S. government. And then Teddy, as Martin is talking about, this Teddy installs this whole crew.
So it is under him.
He creates the predecessor to the FBI, but it's also
that's right, because it's founded in the Bureau of Investigation is founded in 1908.
It was done against the U.S. Congress, first of all. And at the same time they created what they called military intelligence, which took it out of the hands of the military. It's all this British originated stuff, and this guy Dancy was just sitting there in Washington. He's a British spy. I think he might have even been a traitor during World War II. But anyway, that you can look that stuff up. But I've really enjoyed your let me just say this because I have to go take care of my wife, but your emphasis on what's the implications for Teddy Roosevelt and this deification of him and so forth is so important in our history and in the history of the world. It's absolutely, we have to put a cover over that image on Mount Rushmore, I would say. So I gotta go. So thank you so much. That was terrific.
Bye, Tony.
Okay.
One more was William Stevenson, a Canadian.
Yes, he's famous, of course.
Quiet Canadian.
Yeah, he came in later, running things like Camp X. We have Jim who has been waiting to throw a thought out. Jim, go for it.
It's a thought that maybe should be just thrown out. Let me just thank Marty for another just astounding presentation. I'm always stand in awe at the depth and breadth of his knowledge. This is a fairly simple question. It may not be significant, but when we talk about U.S. entry into World War I, the name of Edward House, Colonel House, usually comes up. And I'm just wondering, you mentioned that you believe that Wilson was somewhat ambivalent about getting into the war. To what extent was Colonel House a significant influence, especially given his reputed close relationship with the British?
That's a very interesting one, because again, I'm sorry Anton had to go. I think he would have been in a much better position to answer this, as he was at Cynthia's key question, than I am, because I've not looked closely to House, but he is a shadowy figure. And by shadowy, I don't mean wielding very decisive influence deep behind the scenes, but by being immensely influential, apparently, but not wielding it in decisive ways. If you look at Churchill is, you know, to use a famous phrase from I think from the New Testament, I think it's Jesus' phrase, an Israelite without guile. You always know where Churchill is coming from. And whether he's lying outrageously or just giving the show away by praising bastards. You know, these are both Churchill's specialities. And in the world crisis, Churchill has contempt for Wilson for not coming into the war sooner. Churchill, of course, adapts the Theodore Roosevelt model entirely. Had America come into the war at the beginning, the war would have been over immediately, civilization would have been saved, blah, blah, blah. He writes a very intriguing fiction after the war about this. We can get to that. But Churchill on Colonel House is totally ambivalent. Even Churchill cannot make up his mind about House. He says House tells Wilson what to think. But it doesn't. None of it seems to go anywhere. It doesn't seem to make sense. And when Wilson splits from House, as his megalomania is getting out of control after he's had one of his later strokes, literally at Versailles, the division between House and Wilson breaks out, and House enjoys a very bizarre afterlife in American politics and popular culture as a champion of the dream of the League of Nations, and is taken up by FDR and the liberal Democrats in the late 1920s and early 1930s. And I think it very likely he was a figure of much more influence on behalf of the British at that time. But I stress, I think I do not have the specialized knowledge in that area. And in fact, if you can chime in here, Cynthia, I would be grateful, or anyone else, because again, House is the right-hand man and alter ego of Wilson, but in foreign policy as in domestic policy. And he seems to be very cunning in effective in domestic policy. I mean, Wilson is a very rigid figure. When he drops House, he loses all his political flexibility and agility that has previously, and I don't like Wilson. I think I loathe him bringing us into World War I. I find his anti-Black racism vile and contemptible to the highest degree. And of course, he creates the IRS, he creates the our Internal Revenue Service, who continue to bleed all good Americans like myself dry to this day. So no, I don't like Wilson at all. But there's no question his rise is very effective in politics, and he even runs rings around Teddy Roosevelt, which is not an easy thing to do from 1912 to 1916 and thereabouts. And as long as he listens to House, he's very effective in domestic politics. But once he drops House, then it's another story. As to House's more wider view, my understanding is that House gets on very well with very powerful Wall Street elements. What House is into is in the business of keeping America out of the war, but supplying Britain and France with limitless armament contracts, all of which they have to pay cash on the barrel for. And therefore, Wall Street, the big industrialists, love him for that reason. But I stand to be both corrected on that and have empty parts of the picture filled out.
Thank you for that, Martin. I personally don't have anything to add to that. Cynthia, I don't know if you No, okay. All right, we have a thought. Actually, Scott has a question. I had a thought that sort of pertains to some of what's been said about 5 minutes ago regarding the British influence in America with the death of McKinley. And I think in terms of, I don't know about the details so much, but I know in terms of the security doctrine of Alfred Thayer Mahan being a very important figure
Oh,
in
yes.
shaping a new security doctrine for U.S. foreign policy, especially as far as it pertains to modeling itself on British maritime hegemony. It's a very important breaking point, which McKinley was completely in opposition to, and he was much more favorable to trying to push back against this type of Anglo-American expansion
Completely.
policy. Even though the Philippine debacle happened under him, he was still always pushing back against it and always trying to fight for a certain return to the Monroe Doctrine. Whereas Teddy Roosevelt just went the other direction completely. And Teddy actually made it certain that every member of Congress would receive a copy of Alfred Thayer Mahan's book on, I forgot the name of the book, but basically saying that the U.S. should model itself on the greatness of Britain.
Sea power on history.
Which one?
The influence of sea power on world
That's
history.
the one. Yeah, exactly. And the idea of treating the Chinese and treating Russians rather than looking at them as potential allies in win-win cooperation with big projects guiding the show and the discussion, it was seen as, treat everybody like they're all enemies, which I think that
Except
really
the British Empire.
Mm.
And
So,
perhaps
I don't know if you have something you wanted to say quickly on that, or should I just go to Scott's question?
well, either way, I fully agree with everything you've said completely. And T.R. is very open about this. And of course, so are even T.R.'s most hagiographic biographers. For the record, in terms of mainstream history, easily the worst and therefore the most popular is Edmund Morris with his enormous 3-volume hagiography on Teddy Roosevelt, which is very revealing, but not in ways he intends. And by far the best and most balanced I have found is by a very fine American professor of history, H.W. Brands, who wrote a 1-volume biography. I found the most revealing quotes on T.R., the most embarrassing and revealing quotes are picked up from H.W. Brands. Morris doesn't use any of them. And I found that fascinating. But there's, you're completely correct. There is a book, I don't even like it, but again, it's written by someone of a T.R. lover, by Evan Thomas, formerly of Newsweek magazine, called The War Lovers, about going to, and again, he recites in a very dutiful manner the accounts of going to war against the Spanish. And of course, the key event there was another outrageous deep state crime. It was the sinking of the USS Maine. Now, this was a mystery for 80 years and is still largely disputed as such, but the best research in it was done by, of all people, the late Admiral Hyman Rickover, the founder and creator of America's nuclear navy, and a very, in his own way, very incorruptible, which is why he was eventually forced out of power by the Reaganite neocons in the 1980s. And he was Jewish himself. Well, not by religion, but by ethnic background. I think he was actually a Presbyterian. But Admiral Rickover goes down in a diving bell and sends specialists down to investigate the wreck of the Maine during the Carter administration, and carries out an analysis that's been done. And remember, this is one of the most eminent ship designers in all of American and modern world history. And he comes to the definite conclusion that the explosion that destroyed the Maine came from within and not without. In other words, it could not have been the Spanish, it could not have been a mine exploding the ship from the outside, which was the casus bellus for us going to war under fraudulent circumstances in 1898. It was from within the ship. Now, the conventional wisdom, which Evan Thomas, of course, swallows happily, is that this was simply from an explosive fire in a coal bunker. And it's certainly true that after the explosion of the Maine, other American battleships of the same class had stronger doors put in to protect their magazines from the inner danger of detonation from the coal bunkers, from coal fires, right? So theoretically, of course, to anybody who's never been on a ship or never had access to an engineer in their lives, let alone common sense, it sounds plausible as it's meant to. But there is, given all the battleships, and there were literally several hundred of them, which were built for the United States, British, French, Russian, Japanese, Italian, and Spanish navies in the second half of the 19th century, all of them. There is not a single other case of a battleship blowing up because fires in its coal bunker detonated its powder magazines, where the explosives for the shells in the guns were kept. It never happened anywhere. It is unique to the Maine, and no one has even come up with a plausible, detailed engineering mechanism whereby it could have been carried out. So it clearly was sabotage. Clearly was sabotage. And the sabotage had a very direct purpose, which again succeeded. It was like the Gulf of Tonkin incident. It was a manufactured event to bring us into war, to create empire. Now, Roosevelt might even have known of this, because he probably did not. He did not have to. He was the whole key for my whole presentation today came from a remark you said to me, Matt, in one of our email discussions a few months ago. Before, as you and others all too well know, I fell off the grid because I've been swamped by other things I had to do. But you described Theodore to me as, well, he's such a nitwit, isn't he? And that was the key phrase that fell into place. I suddenly realized, yes, this is why the serious war, manufacturers of war in London and New York loved him so much, because he was stupid enough to do what they wanted him to do. I would say the same thing, incidentally, about George W. Bush. They thought Donald Trump was too. They thought they could press his buttons. And to a limited degree, they could, because as Jim especially knows, and Jim and I have been looking in our different perches, have been looking at this very closely. Trump has done a lot of bellicose, irresponsible, plain stupid things, but he's always, like Khrushchev and Kennedy in the Cuban War crisis, he's always pulled back from the brink of any real war. And he was furious at John Bolton. He never forgave Bolton for trying to sabotage his peace talks with Korea. For Bolton, this is perfectly normal behavior. And Reagan had indulgently put up with it. Though in Reagan's case, Reagan always appears, I knew Reagan personally. Reagan is fascinating. Both Reagan and the first President Bush are much more dangerous and formidable and serious personalities and intellects than they are ever allowed themselves to appear in public and than they are made out to be. They are both infinitely more serious figures. And Bush is a very frightening one. But in Reagan's case, Reagan is this aw-shucks guy from the Midwest. And he always lets himself be shunted around and pushed around and manipulated to where he wanted to go himself in the first place. And then when the people who had all at once want magical influence on him, when they want him to go to places he doesn't want to go, all of a sudden they're gone. He fires them. And other people are brought in to influence him instead. Hugely helpful. Reagan is a wonderfully subtle figure, in his own way as much as Franklin Roosevelt. If I may, just one wonderful line from Reagan, whose humor and wit are remarkably intelligent. I mean, what can you say about a man who, when he has been, a 69-year-old man is shot half an inch from his heart, and he's cracking jokes when he's being wheeled off to an operation he knows he may not survive. He isn't just cracking jokes. They're good jokes. Now that's grace under pressure. I'm sorry, as usual, I'm wandering off here, but again, in terms of the Maine, there is a casus belli. And in terms of Cynthia's point about the coup in 1901, absolutely. And I knew nothing of what Anton told us. And bless Anton, of course he was there ahead of everybody else. Yes. Of course he was, like you both are. And that's a missing piece in the picture. It's a huge piece in the picture because it gives teeth to me. The coup of 1901 is a total reality. And the national security doctrine of the United States of America is totally changed in 1901. And we should actually take this a little bit further. because Franklin, there's another parallel with 100 years later. Theodore Roosevelt leaves office voluntarily in 1908. His chosen successor is, as I said, the man who quietly presided over the murder of 2 million Filipinos, and that is William Howard Taft, who goes on to be Chief Justice of the United States. And national security doctrine and the building of the modern battleships, which was started on such a massive scale by TR, continues apace under the new administration. But then a Democrat gets in. And of course, Democrats, as we know, are all peaceful and lovable, though every major war the United States has fought in the past 100 years, 120 years now, started under a Democratic administration, right? And this president is Woodrow Wilson, who, like Barack Obama, knows nothing about foreign affairs and war and doesn't want to. And who does he appoint as his Assistant Secretary of the Navy? A young, bright politician with no obvious qualifications except his name, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a state senator from New York. Okay. And why does FDR want the job? Because Teddy Roosevelt had it before him, and it was obviously a stepping stone to the presidency. But he holds that job for 8 years. And his boss is a Tennessee heartland politician who likes to drink his bourbon and shows no interest in administration whatsoever. He's a politically cunning fellow who knows how to handle Congress, but he hates the whole business of dealing with big business and industry and United States Steel and the Rockefellers and the shipyards and the Navy. And FDR loves this stuff. He loves the Navy. Even in the 1930s, when George Marshall becomes Chief of Staff of the Army, on one of his early meetings with the president, he says to Mr. President, at least when we're discussing Army-Navy priorities, could you stop referring to the Navy as us and the Army as they? Right? No question who FDR always backed in the Army-Navy football game. It was very consistent all through. The Navy is Franklin Roosevelt's Navy. And he builds it up to World War I along the same lines he inherited from his cousin. So even under a Democratic president, you have the Mahan theory of battle fleets, which Franklin Roosevelt had also read and loved that book. This has become the national security doctrine of the United States, and it does not change. Now we have a parallel and a lesson here from the 21st century. Our first president is George W. Bush, who promotes eternal war, unwinnable war, the global war on terror, GWOT. And he is succeeded by a Democratic president for 8 years, Barack Obama. But Obama is firmly put in his place by the deep state and former presidents as soon as he gets in office, and is told there are certain things, in fact, a whole lot of things, he must not dare to interfere with. And he doesn't rein in the global war on terror. In some respects, at least, he's more competent at it than the appalling, idiotic Bush too was. He actually gets bin Laden killed. Now, there's a point we ought to add here. Bin Laden should have been public enemy number one, not Saddam Hussein, because bin Laden indisputably was involved in, or behind the attack on the Trade Towers and the murder of 3,000 Americans. So what does George W. Bush do? He and Paul Wolfowitz disband the interagency task force to target bin Laden. And there is no effort at all by the United States government from 2003 to 2008 to go after bin Laden. It takes those well-known wimps, Barack Obama and Joe Biden, who to their credit do care that this guy has or may have the blood of 3,000 innocent Americans or so on his hands. And they reactivate the task force and they quickly get results. But here is Bush, who prides, who struts around as a total phony for years as the great defender of us against the war on terror. And instead, he is funding Al-Qaeda and its associates in Syria and Iraq, and making it possible for their takeover of half the Middle East under Obama, who didn't want it, was taken by surprise by it, but didn't have the wit to reverse the American policies that were making it inevitable to begin with. So we have again here the same parallel we see at the beginning of the century. There is a takeover of government from within. There was a bloodless, well, apart from President McKinley's a bloodless coup in 1901. And in fact, the people who are directly responsible are targeted, and they didn't expect to be. Kropotkin missed two things. First, the American Congress and people are outraged that President McKinley was murdered. And Kropotkin is accused of the murder, and so is Emma Goldman, by sitting members of Congress. Now, she manages to stay untouched because she has strong protectors, so she leaves the country forever in 1910 or 11. Kropotkin remains in total security in Britain, but Kropotkin is outraged when a bill is pushed through Congress by popular demand in 1903 that bars him from ever returning to the United States. The one other thing we should add is the helpful hypocrisy of Teddy Roosevelt. Roosevelt had despised McKinley, treated him like dirt, but does not appear to have known that his own best friend had worked personally with Kropotkin to organize the assassination. And as I mentioned, as I went into some detail on before, Kropotkin and Goldman have actually visited Buffalo and worked with the long-standing anarchist revolutionary and violent cell in Buffalo, the most violent anarchist cell in North America, only several months before the assassination, that same year in 1901. And Emma Goldman, who was one of the closest friends of Kropotkin and almost certainly his lover over a 30-year period, she is one of the pallbearers at his funeral in Moscow in the early 1920s. She indisputably meets the assassin, Leon Czolgosz, who is a Polish, an out-of-work Polish steel worker fallen on hard times. And by the way, this is also part of Kropotkin as a Russian aristocrat. This is also part of Kropotkin's established methodology of assassination, because he and the quite aristocratic Sofia Andreevna recruit the man who threw the grenades that killed Tsar Alexander, was another Polish dolt, Russian version of the name Grudinsky. In both cases, they have the Russian traditional aristocratic disdain for Poles. Poles are Polacks, brainless idiots to be used and manipulated, by their betters to carry out the messy deeds that need to be done. And this is how, this is the mechanism that is used to kill the great Tsar. And this is the same mechanism is used identically to kill President McKinley. And thanks to Henry Cabot Lodge, McKinley has, and his friends, McKinley has been convinced to put Teddy Roosevelt on the ticket. And this is supposed at the time, as I said before, the finest political intellect in the Republican Party, Senator Mark Hanna of New York, who was the Karl Rove of the day, or the, oh, hang on, I don't think we have such a Svengali under President Trump, but the political mastermind behind the election of the president, right? And he's worked with McKinley all his life. He's McKinley's closest friend. And Hanna says, you cannot, Mr. President, you cannot, he's on record for saying this, you cannot put that man on the ticket beside you. You will be signing your own death warrant. And he goes around Congress saying, we can't, he goes around the Republican National Convention that year and says, you cannot put a lunatic and an idiot like Roosevelt within a heartbeat of the presidency. And of course, he's right. And what happens to Mark Hanna? Well, another body we should exhume for signs of arsenic or anything else that might have lasted a period of time. He dies a few months, just simply of ill health, very conveniently, before TR is nominated for his full presidential term in his own name in 1904. And TR has been fearful of Hanna. Hanna has been a restraining influence on him during his first term. And Hanna doesn't want to re-elect him as president. He doesn't want to re-elect, but convenient. You find this throughout TR's career. Convenient deaths pave the way. But the key one I would look to is Vice President Hobart in 1899. It's interesting the way Edmund Morris treats this. Morris, of course, is an idiot. So he simply says, There's all this boomletting talk about Teddy Roosevelt being so wonderful and exceptional that he should come on the ticket as vice president. And Roosevelt doesn't want to do it because he knows just being vice president is the most powerless position in the American government. As governor of New York, he can grandstand, he can make a name for himself, just as he managed to start a war when he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. What can he do as vice president? One man talks Roosevelt into accepting the vice presidency. His best friend, of course, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge. Incidentally, the same man who scuppered us going into the League of Nations in 1920, though that was more Wilson's bungling than Cabot Lodge's. When we set up the United Nations in 1944, not 45, in 44, the serious work was drawn up. President Franklin Roosevelt is quite determined and very clear that all the limitations on American sovereignty, which Henry Cabot Lodge objected to before the League of Treaty Nations could be signed, FDR actually agrees to all of them. He says these are not real problems. The real issue is to set up the world organizational body. And the four nations that will make it stop this being a joke like the League of Nations were will be Russia, the Soviet Union, China, and the British Empire and America working together as the four horsemen of anti-apocalypse, the four horsemen of peace. This is his conception at the time. He isn't even anti-British in that sense. But of course, FDR is very anti-British Empire, enormously anti-British Empire. And this is a consistent picture you find throughout the war. And of course, British historians, led by Churchill, bend over backwards to deny this in Roosevelt.
Martin, it is such a pleasure to hear these lessons, and I think that one of the biggest, a whole book can be written. I'm pretty sure you're far on your way to have accomplished this goal. But the role of these anarchist movements that just peppered the world at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century as a coordinated device of empire is such a valuable lesson for people to learn and internalize. And I think what makes it additionally epistemologically rich, the way you're treating it, is that you tie in the Darwinian aspect, that these are individuals who might seem Christian, but actually their true fidelity is to a deeper Darwinian view of the universe and of man. And I think that really is just very deep. And there's so many lessons that can be learned and applied to understanding our current predicament in society. Because I mean, of course, the thought that just occurred to me was, as you were speaking, that, Darwin's theory of evolution, or that approach to that interpretation of explaining how new species come and go and old species go, which is very much premised on, as Darwin himself says, his studies of Malthus's Essays on Population, which Darwin describes in his autobiography, gave him the insight upon thinking about the struggle that all things have to exist in a world of diminishing returns. He's like, aha, that's it. That's the mechanism that explains what I'm looking at in the Galapagos and these other things. And he's just looking at Malthus and repackaging it. And people think, well, yeah,
exactly.
Politically, his theories are abused by Herbert Spencer and Galton, but really the true Darwinian theory that Huxley defended is pure science. And it's like, well, no, there's political agendas that you could see, and even Darwin admits in his Descent of Man that only the stupidest of creatures would allow their weakest to reproduce. And then he goes on to say, well, but we're moral, so we keep our weak alive, and we allow the weak to reproduce. But it's like he's saying that as a moral person, because he doesn't like his theory, but he's like, unfortunate. We morally cannot abide by my theory as a species, but Herbert Spencer is just more honest about it, and he's like more consistent that, yeah, this is the way the universe works, and this is the way we should also operate as a species. So the fact that you tie this into the anarchist movement, which hides behind this masquerade of chaos, that just, if you want creative change, you just create anarchy to disrupt order, and then better things happen.
It's classic neoconservative and neoliberal too theory, which has become dominant in this country in the last 40 years.
Mm-hmm.
We now have our own Comintern. We call it the Institute. I think Jim is a much greater expert on this than I am, but we have both International Republican Institute, and we have the National Endowment for Democracy. And they basically work to subvert what we disapprove of as authoritarian regimes around the world. But it's not just authoritarian regimes. You look at Brazil, a nation of 200 million people, whose public elected progressive, social democratic, acclaimed, popular, stable presidents 4 times in a row, 2 twice elected presidents. And we were behind the manipulation and toppling of that for Bolsonaro, an open fascist and an incompetent one at that, to take over. We did the same thing in Bolivia. I mean, I was making these arguments against neocons and face to their faces in Washington under the Reagan administration 30 years ago, and you can guess how far I got there. And the smarming look of arrogant self-regard on the faces of all of them. I'm sure, Jim, you being in Washington, have seen so much of this over the years too. The only thing I've ever seen like it is on the faces of Trotskyites, who also believed in a permanent revolution in British universities in the 1960s. Well, you know, you're a lovable little idiot from the sticks, and we pat you on the head, and you have your wild curly hair. But we are intellectuals. We are serious. We know better. We have what Tolstoy calls the green stick, the secret key to eternal human happiness that works in every case. They're all contemptible. They're all cowards. They all believe this. They all believe this. But if I may, you raised so many wonderful issues, Matt. First of all, I would like to, starting even immediately, to set up a 4-way conversation with you, Cynthia, and Anton specifically, and actually anyone else here as well, who very much. But in terms of putting together a book on the gestalt of the anarchists in the 1880s and 90s, if you put together all the different aspects of work that you both and Anton and myself have already done, we're pretty close to a book on that already. And given the uncertainties of the world, the sooner we put it together, or even get it out on your website and through Canadian Patriot Review and through our other outlets and platforms, the better it is. But we're very close to a book on that, because the material on this is coming together extraordinarily fast. I only got into this by accident and very recently. I only got into this because I was interested in Tsar Alexander, as Jim knows, because of Tsar Alexander's role in protecting the Union and the cause against slavery during the American Civil War. That in turn led me to the assassination of the Tsar, a subject which I had studied in depth at Oxford, but only again so I had all the facts, but none of the skeptical analysis or questioning framework to address the facts. And I found that, again, it's like, you know, great art. When you look at things to a different perspective, when you look at things through the eye of a Pablo Picasso, or a Van Gogh, or the French Impressionists, or a Turner, it's completely different from looking at things from the more classic representational art that comes before them. You have a completely new way of looking at the universe, right? And you have a completely new way of interpreting your facts. Or rather, you can deeply understand your fact, and more importantly, in classic Socratic style, you learn to ask exactly, Cynthia, the right questions, exactly. And of course, it's an old Talmudic Jewish view as well, though they bungled it where the Greeks went much further and rightly with it. The question is the key, because however many different answers you come up, they'll be revealing answers.
Martin, you're such a, oh wait, I have to close the door because me and Matt are too close.
Sorry.
I wanted to just say you're such a treasure trove, and you have so many leads, and I think that Matthew and myself are very much open, along with other people, because like Jerry is also a very experienced historian, and Anton, but you have like a conception of the book, the what is the composition that you want to do, and we can help you. Like we can not even be like, you know, a name on the book, like we can just be like an assistant.
I think you should, but that's another story.
Like you and Anton, you know, can be a name on the book or whatever. Like I think that would be a really awesome collaboration, but you can for certain just delegate, and we will be happy to assist you.
The ironies of life. But I mean, if I go into that, we'll be here all night. You won't put up with me quite long enough on that. But there, again, everything you were both saying, it's like hitting the key points on the map again. Even I ventured off before with William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan is always devoutly Christian, an old-fashioned Protestant, but he's not a know-nothing 6,000 years old fundamentalist. He doesn't believe God opened the world in 6 or 7 days. He takes science seriously. He's not the buffoon he is made out to be by the modern American liberal Darwinian consensus. In the movie, there was an excellent article on this by Gary Wills a number of years ago, the Tennessee Monkey Trial. Was not the shameful breaking of Bryan and fundamentalism in America it was made out to be. In the trial in 1926, in the liberal interpretation of it, and in the classic movie made in the 1960s, which is a wonderfully made movie. It even has Gene Kelly playing H.L. Mencken, of all things, in it, right? And he's very good. He's wonderful in the role. He steals the show. He's that good. But the real emphasis of the movie is Christian morality is evil, and Darwinian science is enlightened, humane.
Oh.
Now, actually, what Gary Wills found was, in the movie, and it was true in the real trial, the defenders of, the champions of evolution, who are out to discredit Tennessee's law against teaching evolution, right, bring some of the most eminent scientists in America from Harvard and Columbia universities and Yale, to testify on behalf of the scientific validity of Darwin. And sure enough, as happened in the real trial, they're not allowed to testify. Now, the lesson in the movie is therefore very simple. You know, science is good. That idiot Christian Bryan is anti-science. But who were these scientists? They were all experts in eugenics. They were all racists. Most of them favored the extermination of children born with Down's baby syndrome. Incidentally, Franklin Roosevelt was a supporter of that, even at least through the first term of his presidency.
Early on, he rejected it later on.
Yeah, FDR does grow. He evolves a lot, even in his last decade of life as president. He really does. And there's an irony to that. But I mean, look at the family he comes from, right? But he has a lot of growing to do. But in the Tennessee Monkey Trial, the people who are all those professors were fierce opponents of immigration into America. They wanted it to remain, they were anti-Chinese and anti-Jewish and anti-Black, of course, right? But they were also anti-Catholic, anti-Orthodox Christian, anti-Slav, and anti-Mediterranean. Not much left, is there, right? And they were fierce about this. They were ferocious, and many of them became admirers of Hitler after Hitler took power in Germany. And none of this, of course, is in the play or the movie, right? About the Tennessee Monkey Trial. By contrast, what led Bryan to attack Darwin? At first, he had supported Darwin. He'd been an enlightened champion of Darwin while thinking about it for 20 years. He said you can reconcile the Darwinian interpretations of science with what we see in history, and it doesn't take away from the central role of Christ and of the New Testament. From a Protestant position, Bryan is very intelligent and enlightened and principled and honorable and consistent. But World War I changes Bryan. He sees what the horrific things the Germans are doing, or he imagines they're doing, both really. And then he sees what we start doing too on our side. He's also horrified. And he asks himself, and he's public about this, where do these horrific conceptions come from? And he traces it. And he comes to exactly the same position that Matt just pointed out. He says they come from Herbert Spencer and his friends, but before that they come from Galton, and most of all, ultimately they come from Darwin. Wow. They come from, and if I can tempt Stephen in here, again, as if we don't already have so much to talk about in email correspondence. If you go back even to the 1830s, there is this there is never physical evidence. The whole theory of evolution is based on having unlimited time in the geological scale, and that there are no massive upheavals or catastrophes in Earth history, such as the Bible and all the ancient cultures of the world and the Native American cultures, all talk about, right? And this comes from from Hutton in Britain, and from a couple of other quote unquote enlightened 1830s to 1840s figures who shaped Darwin's thinking. In other words, these conceptions come from the British Empire. Not only are we going to be here we are going to be here forever. There is no judgment of God coming upon us from the skies. There is no need to fear the heavens. There is no enormous earthquakes coming. Atlantis did not sink, as Plato said, because Atlantis never existed. Very convenient. There are no great divisions in the archaeological record of the Near East showing that civilization was repeatedly destroyed on the continental scale, such as Claude Schaeffer, the greatest archaeologist of the first half of the 20th century and arguably of the past 120 years, pointed out in his book, never translated into English from the French, Comparative Stratigraphy of the Middle East and Near East. In the 3rd and 4th millenniums BC. It has never been translated into English from the French. All of this is denied. All of this is denied. And then, of course, Immanuel Velikovsky comes along in the 1950s with his book, Worlds in Collision. And the problem with Velikovsky is he's scientifically literate. Velikovsky makes a series of advanced predictions about the conditions we will find in the solar system on different planets, including the moon, and in space. And more than 100 of them are fulfilled in the next 20 years by the space program. So he has to be discredited. And he is. At the 1998 American Association for the Advancement of Science seminar, and the key figure in doing so is a key scientific figure in the American deep state over 30 years, Carl Sagan. So for those of us who are into the electric universe too, and one more point I'll mention, there is a man called Hannes Alfvén, who is a mainstream scientist, who is one of the wins the Nobel Prize for Physics because of his work on ionized gas plasma in space. Now, when we look at Albert Einstein, the deified Einstein, you notice I let my hair grow. I do so for 2 reasons. Well, 3 reasons. The first is I actually have it still at my age. But the second reason is, my wife points out, you're lucky you still have it. You know, one of these days, if you get it cut too short, maybe it won't grow back. So Debbie is very much about me getting haircuts. Right? But the third reason is good career move. Because when I was younger, it made me look not serious at American, you know, having an afro when you're white. It's not a good career move in Reagan's Washington, right? Even when you can't help it. But when you reach my age and you're kind of too old to be taken serious or a threat anymore. There's a great line from one of the Flashman novels on that too, that Steve may recall. And as the 70s are a wonderful decade, you can get away with anything because everybody thinks you're too senile, you know, to be doing it deliberately, right? But right now, I think it's in a subliminal message. And what's the message? It's in the heart of our culture. The God of genius, the God of science, Albert Einstein, who reinterprets time and space. We were lost without him. There was no civilization before Einstein, right? So if you grow your hair long, my God, maybe he's almost as bright as Einstein, right? Now, there's no evidence anywhere else to support this view. But then you see, why did Einstein come up with relativity? Because he thought space was empty. And gravity, no force can propagate through a vacuum. And everybody agrees on this, and it's true. So he comes up with all his fancy designs on relativity to get around the fact that gravity can't work, as Newton said, because space is empty. But we now know the Michelson-Morley experiment of 1886 was simply wrong, especially thanks to Hannes Alfvén, and especially thanks to Explorer 1 and all the satellites that have gone up since the International Geophysical Year of 1958. The universe, not just our solar system, but the entire universe, is filled with ionized gas plasma, which is the condition in which the electric universe propagates and functions. So you don't even need to play games with relativity and bizarre German conceptions of theoretical gravity. And actually, Einstein and Velikovsky were friends for 5 years, bizarrely. And they lived close to each other in Princeton. Velikovsky's wife used to play the violin with Einstein. They were in the same quartet for a number of years. The interconnections and ironies all over the place here are both hilarious and truly colorful and bizarre. In 1954-55, Einstein and Velikovsky have a debate, and it's recorded in the correspondence, on does Jupiter give out electric sound? Is it capable of having magnetic fields? And Einstein says, according to the physics he has known all his life, why, Emmanuel, this is preposterous. Of course, it's just a planet. Your idea, I love you dearly and you're brilliant, but these are, as usual, your ideas are cockamamie and absurd. And then, of course, in 1955, the Bell Laboratories in New Jersey, of all places, detect radio signals coming out from Jupiter. And the guys who identified as coming from Jupiter rightly get the Nobel Prize for Physics for this, quite correctly. And when Einstein dies only a couple of weeks later, and an open copy of Velikovsky's book, Worlds in Collision, the section at the end of the book very short section that discusses the need to take electricity more seriously than gravity as a motive force in the universe, is open on Einstein's desk when he dies. And his secretary, Helen Ducat, testifies to this. Mm-hmm. But of course, this has also therefore gone down the rabbit hole of non-history. Yeah. It never happened. It never happened.
Well, Scott had shared with me a little while ago a letter, I believe, that it was Einstein who had written to Velikovsky, where he actually acknowledges that Velikovsky had a lot of, I think he renounces his doubts of Velikovsky's views on some of the scientific forecasts that he was making. And I don't know if it was in regards to Jupiter's emissions or if it was in something else. I know for myself, I think that there's an immense amount of merit in his scientific views, especially the Birkeland currents, the electric universe, and his forecasts are undeniable scientifically. For me, and what I've looked at is that there's sort of two bodies of theory in Velikovsky's work that sometimes get enmeshed that I don't think one necessitates the other. And I think his literalist interpretation of ancient mythologies to account for the origins of the physical phenomena of the heavens that he's aptly able to navigate and describe. I don't see the same rigor and firm foundation scientifically in that analysis to say that Aeschylus or Sophocles or the Vedas were literal recounts of things that we were actually literally seeing. That's where I personally have had my doubts and that's why we developed like red in our retina, because we evolved in a red universe when Mars. Anyway, I think there's an immense amount of wonderful ideas, and I think maybe that could be incorporated into the class that you might want to give in our upcoming science course pack that's coming up soon.
It never occurred to me, but probably yes. And I think you also know Velikovsky died in 1979, and his ideas have sprung off into lots of wild directions, which make even previous radical creatures like me, look like incredibly conservative by contrast. And I agree very much with your distinction in the areas where we can find a remarkable amount of substantive scientific supportive evidence, and the areas of speculation, which, even while they're wonderful to imagine as science fiction, there simply cannot be any supportive evidence for, because even if they were right, how can you prove it? You can't. Exactly. But and the trouble, of course, is when people go off in those wild directions, they don't stick to what is substantive. And one thing I found enormously substantive, and again, even this alone, two places where he's enormously substantive, and actually, this even comes into global warming, because most of our global warming terror and fear and our hatred of greenhouse gases was created again by our old friend Carl Sagan. And Sagan comes up with the theory in the first place to prove Velikovsky was wrong and not right. Velikovsky predicted based, and he has a methodology for doing so. He explains very why. He says, if the basic picture I see of the heavens, not just in mythology, but in Babylonian star maps, Venus does not exist. Venus appears as first as a comet, and then only later as a planet, and it isn't in the earliest star systems that we find going back, really back to the earliest Sumerian and Babylonian time. This has been endlessly disputed and argued. It's never been disproven, actually, so he may be right. But this is where he is coming from. But he then says, if my reading on this is correct, then Venus is an incredibly modern planet. It does not go back billions of years like the Earth and Mars and the others most likely do. It only appeared, was in our solar system tens of thousands of years ago, and only cooled down into its present orbit literally a few thousand years ago, not just within human memory, but within recorded human memory, he says, if I am correct, right? That's his position. But he then goes on and says, but if this is the case, then two things must apply. Venus must be found to be incredibly hot. It must have an atmosphere of very heavy carbon-based gases. And it must have a surface temperature of at least 750 degrees centigrade, not even Fahrenheit. It must be hot enough to melt lead. He is very specific about this. And then he finally makes another prediction. And this is back in 1950. All of this is in his 1950 book. And he'd come to these conclusions some years before that, but he publishes it in 1950. He says, Venus will also be found to rotate in the opposite direction to all the other planets, which was impossible, you've got it, Matt, according to the motion of the entire solar system gradually being gas that coalesces into bodies and rotating and slowly. Again, notice a reassuring uniformitarian British imperial conception of reality, right? British imperial conception of reality, right?
Martin, we need to go for drinks, seriously.
Oh, I was going to say,
drink with you.
I would suggest, at the very least, I see you and Matt have excellent taste in red wines. Let's at least do it across these things. And eventually, when we get you down to Washington, or I am permitted by my jailers, my wife and daughters, to venture north of the border again, right? After this unpleasantness is over. But all of this applies. So then, of course, in the 1960s, the first Soviet and then American probes confirm it, find that all these things apply on Venus, but there is no standing geophysical explanation for this. Either Velikovsky is right after all, or something new must be found. So what does Carl Sagan do? He wins the love of the deep science establishment in America, precisely by coming up with a wonderful new theory. It's called global warming. It flies in the face of the second law of thermodynamics, which, to add insult to injury, is not just one of the most fundamental laws of physics, but it's put together by one of my great fellow Northern Irishmen, Lord Kelvin, whose family I think originally came from Ulster, or he taught in Belfast for a while. But the great 19th century British physicist, Lord Kelvin, in our universe, matter is always things are always cooling down, heading towards a state of disorder and entropy, unless we gin them up. So where is all this energy in Venus coming from? Volcanism cannot come up with it. So what does Sagan come up with? He comes up with a brilliant lie: global warming. It's a lie on the global scale. It's so enormous, right? It flies in the face of the law of the conservation of energy. And everybody believes it. Because you have a thick atmosphere, sunlight can come in and volcanic eruptions can come within the planet, and all the heat is trapped in and nothing can radiate out, right? I'm oversimplifying, of course, but that's basically it. But then, of course, they all agree with it enormously about Venus. And they then apply it to Earth too. It's a wonderful, convenient way to sell the nightmare of global warming. And this works. My wife and I are totally skeptical about this, but we have 3 kids in their 20s, all of whom were gone to some of the finest, quote unquote, universities in America, and came up with one of the most supposedly finest public school systems in America. And they all swallow this nonsense hook, line, and sinker.
Hey, just quick, the World Economic Forum that I follow sometimes, Dave does too. Their most recent post this week was we've just discovered one of the closest Earth-like planets, that Venus was once Earth-like, inhabitable, but global warming
Yes, exactly.
destroyed that.
There
That
is
was
no evidence for this. None.
Yeah.
There is no evidence for this. But one last point,
Too
and
many
that is again.
SUVs on Venus.
You first. I'm sorry, I go on enough here.
I just said too many SUVs on Venus is all I said. And then Scott has a question he's been dying to ask after you
Please, I'm
out,
sorry.
and then we should probably maybe wrap it up. But yeah, go for it, Martin.
Oh, the other point from
no, Martin.
Sorry, no, Scott, you go ahead, please.
Okay, all right, Scott.
Well, did you want to make another point, a quick one with the Venus?
Yes, but I mean, my quick points are never quick. You go ahead, please. That's fine.
Okay.
You know that.
I read that, this whole point, I'm glad you brought that up. I just couldn't, I doubled over it. It's like, oh my God, yeah. Venus, the beginnings of global warming started Venus. And anyway, my question, I loved great lecture, presentation, Martin, as always.
Thank you.
And so my interest here, and Matt and I have talked about this, but I'm a bit of a Sinophile. One of my interests is, ancient China. But in the modern age, it's just amazing how we have a connection to China. We don't even know it. We have the Sun Yat-sen Garden here in Vancouver. And probably 9.5 out of 10 people I ask have no idea who he was or what it was about. And even that he raised money for his revolution in Canada, even though, but so here's and I was putting together, and what we learned about Sun Yat-sen was, from one of our mentors, was that his officer corps for his revolutionary army they were trained in California. And according to another book that Matt has a copy of too, The Beautiful Country in the Middle Kingdom, which I haven't really gotten into yet, but I got to, was the facet of what it lays bare is the China trade, as they call it, the opium trade, which made families like Forbes and the Delano's immensely rich and powerful. And what we've been talking about with Theodore Roosevelt, to me, strikes of this epic battle between the Anglophiles and the Republican faction. And to me, when all of this information coming forward is, it's just the implementation of the Round Table movement, particularly in these, and that Theodore Roosevelt is a prime example of that subversion of what McKinley represents in the legacy of Lincoln and Washington. So, and what I was starting to theorize is, well, is it McKinley who was the main supporter of Sun Yat-sen's officer corps at the time, and or his networks, and the key strategic and his role, which you brought up about the massacre and the control subversion of the Filipino independence movement with 2 million people. And to me, that it just, like, there's a history there that we need to better understand, because I think that one of the horrific things that are not known is that add to what you've been saying is Teddy's role in those massacres, and which ultimately led to the massacres in Nanking and the funding of the fascists in Japan by the British and on all of them. And so it's a pivotal moment when McKinley is shot. And I'm just my question is there was, I guess, this hard drive, I think, that represented by McKinley and those factions for the nation state driving to carry over from when Lincoln had started in the Industrial Revolution, the Meiji Restoration, to really try and establish firm, strong economic development, which they'd started in Japan, to China, in this effort, which would have saved, maybe not the First World War, but probably, well, maybe that too, but in the Second World War, the Pacific Front and the rest of that. And I was just wondering what your thoughts and information, were about that.
The trouble with having a party with friends who are brilliant and like-minded is that you have to get me to stop, because these are just wonderfully rich and limitless topics. I know far too little about the US-China interaction, but I can speak a little about it. I know a bit more, and I think Anton and Cynthia and Manuel, others of you can fill in a lot more on the very dark and utterly evil and destructive impact that Teddy Roosevelt had on Northeast Asia, which we will go into. And then there is the way the Japanese version changes from something that is extremely admirable in the 19th century to something that is limitlessly dark in the 20th century, after, not during, but after World War I. And these issues are, of course, interrelated. Putting it into hopefully manageable form, the key figure here is not McKinley himself, but his Secretary of State, who Teddy Roosevelt maintains as his Secretary of State for continuity of policy. He has to replace him eventually. John Hay, H-A-Y. Now, Hay is a figure of another of these figures we keep finding of extraordinary longevity, not just in life, but in policy, because we first meet him as one of Abraham Lincoln's 2 personal private secretaries throughout the Civil War.
Oh, yes. Okay. I know who you're talking about now. Yes. Okay.
Indeed, you do. And he becomes Secretary of State under 2 Republican presidents, William McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt.
Right.
And he is the champion of the open door in China, which is basically, the American view is they want China weak. They're not out to conflict with China, with the British Empire. But basically, China is big enough that we can all carve it up between us. That is what the real issue of the open door is. And Teddy Roosevelt accepts it completely and loves it. We start there. We move to Japan. Now, the Meiji Restoration starts out exactly the way you say. It is of enormous historical significance because there are other successful examples from Ethiopia to Thailand, and you can even include Germany in this, of resistance to modernity, to malign modernity, to malign internationalism, to the malign building of international empires, destroying every society that stands in their way. But without question, the most successful example of this, they succeeded as the Mesoamericans and the Incas failed, is modern Japan and the Meiji Restoration, right? What you find is from the 1870s onwards, the Meiji Restoration people make alliance and with their kindred spirits in 2 key nations, the United States and Germany. They admire what Bismarck is doing in Germany, and they're quite heavily influenced by it, in a positive way, I stress. They also admire Lincoln enormously, and they study him closely. In 1877, the most highest level American official to that point in history visits Japan. He is a former president of the United States. It will be another 80 to 90 years before another president of the United States visits Japan after World War II.
Right.
And that figure is?
President Grant.
Yes, exactly. Who has already visited Queen Victoria and Benjamin Disraeli in London, neither of whom are liberals, though they are imperialists certainly, but both of whom hold him in the highest regard. And he then spent a great deal of time in Germany. He was also an honored guest of our old friend Tsar Alexander II in St. Petersburg, right? He's on a world tour. No former American president has ever done this before. Until Teddy Roosevelt comes along, no other will, right?
Right.
He visits Japan. He is held in such high regard by the Meiji Emperor. He is given the highest honor ever given to a non-Japanese in the history of the empire. There is a guard of honor for him. He stays for more than a month. He is given an invitation to stay in Tokyo as an honored guest for the rest of his life. He is held in such high regard. Now, the Japanese, as a warrior people, recognize the enormity of Grant's achievement, which all too many Americans do not. Right? It's the one full-scale continental war the Americans ever had to fight until 1944-45 in Europe. And Grant is the general who won it for them. And it's curious that at least British military historians of a generation that tended after World War I to be more cool-headed and non-judgmental hold Grant in much higher regard than the slave-loving, Southern-dominated, romantic, aristocratic idiots do in America. Oh, a sidetrack here, incidentally. Winston Churchill had no time for Grant whatsoever. His hero, of course, was Robert E. Lee, as you will not be surprised to hear, right? So here is Grant. And he is revered in Meiji Japan. But then Meiji Japan starts to build its sphere of influence and protection against the West, which rapidly, of course, evolves into something rather more than a sphere of protection. It becomes a sphere of empire, which is, as with the British, can be both benign and utterly malign, depending on the circumstances. They pulled Taiwan away from China in the War of 1895. They fight a war against the Russians. And the war is a bloody draw, and the war is tilting against Japan until an unlikely savior intervenes on their behalf. President Roosevelt. Roosevelt negotiates a peace between the Russians and the Japanese. As is always the case with a negotiated peace, both sides are left pretty unhappy with it. But there is no question when you look at it coldly. And actually, I stand to be corrected here because I've started looking into this. It's an important area, but I have no doubt that you two, for starters, and probably half the people in the audience, and certainly Jim, would be in a position to correct me on this, so please do. Roosevelt's influence is strongly against the Tsar. Later, 12 years later, in 1917, he welcomes the Bolshevik Revolution, saying it's a great advance in tolerance and freedom for humanity, right? In 1905, he saves the Japanese from what will be inevitable defeat by long-running Russian forces. And although the Japanese are disappointed they didn't get more, they get a lot. The Russians, and they come out as the victors. The Russians, by contrast, are stopped in the war just when it was tilting in their direction, and the Japanese, who have a much smaller population base, had lost very large and bloody casualties, including the two sons of the leading general, who later became of all things, the chief tutor for the Hirohito emperor, right? And it is Roosevelt's diplomatic intervention at the Portsmouth negotiations that gives Japanese its victory and mortally wounds the Romanov regime in St. Petersburg. A revolution breaks out in Russia. Eventually, the revolution is put down, but not quickly or easily. Massive internal terrorism, aided and abetted by the British and Kropotkin, continue until 1910. The British, though, are becoming ambiguous towards Russia. They had spent most of the 19th century working overtime to destabilize Russia with far greater success than they're even given credit for, or of course, than they want to take public credit for. They succeed in this. Right? And they succeed also in the false story that Russian government is so irrational, so stupid, so primitive, so extreme, that they can never evolve to a mature stability the way we British have. Of course, it helps to be running a permanent campaign of assassination against the chief officials and aristocrats and rulers of your empire, which the British continue to do pretty much up to World War I, right? Against the Russians.
Right.
But the key point here is Teddy Roosevelt has made a decisive influence on behalf of Japan. He does another one. He makes a deal. He travels through East Asia after he is president. and conducts major diplomacy in Tokyo, an agreement is reached. The United States has a free hand in the Philippines, and Japan will not intervene with it, even though they could easily project power. Because, of course, Teddy Roosevelt has done what greedy little boys always do. Greedy little boys always want, my son was not like this, but I was. You know, greedy little boys always try to eat more than they can chew. And empires are like that too. The British were, which is why they fail. And the same theme of imperial overextension is classically fulfilled by the United States today. The Soviets made the same mistake. And what Roosevelt has done is, thanks to his, masculine little war to take the Philippines and killing a couple of million Filipinos, he's projected American power where it cannot be maintained. Even the British cannot protect him against Japan. Japan is now a major imperial power and actually an ally of Britain as well. The Japanese look to Germany for their industrial development, to Germany for their army structure, but to Britain for their navy and for their policy of imperial power. Incidentally, the new emperor in Japan today studied Elizabethan imperialism and sea power when he was at Oxford 40 years ago. You will not find this on any website whatsoever. It has been removed from the official imperial biography. We are simply told he studied the canal system of Britain in Elizabethan times when he was at Oxford.
Interesting.
No, not really. And this has consequences when we come back to Darwin, because Hirohito had a Western education. And he was obsessed. Kropotkin and Hirohito are both biologists. They're not just scientists or Darwinians. You knew this, Matt? They are biologists.
I love how you're like thinking this through. It's great to listen.
Kropotkin actually doesn't approve of Darwin. He doesn't approve of conflict by natural selection. He has a pure communist idea. There is no need for government because the ants don't have government. Cooperation is a basic biological principle in nature. So all we have to do is copy the ants and all will be well. We don't need government. Curiously, he does not follow this policy for his own anarchist movement. It is narrowly and rigidly controlled. For any anarchists who disobey orders from Command Central in London, an anarchist tribunal is set up and they are tried with 3 people sitting in front of them, and then they're shot on the spot. And there are thousands of such murders to enforce discipline in the and coherence in the anarchist movement across the North and South America and Europe. I have not looked at East Asia. You will probably find that there are 2 even, but you certainly find it all across Europe and all across North and South America under Kropotkin, a very tight structured police state. And of course, he fully approves of what Lenin is doing in Moscow when he takes over. There's a famous argument that has been allowed to go public that he has with his lover, Emma Goldman, his fellow mastermind of the assassination of McKinley. Emma Goldman is horrified to find the communist revolution she revered actually still needs a terror apparatus and a government and a bureaucracy that's incompetent on top of everything else. All of that was supposed to wither away. And she doesn't like the communist revolution and she flees. Eventually Canada takes her and the British take care of that. She ends up, I think, in Montreal, doesn't she? Die there in 1940 or so. Look it up. I think that's where she lives out her life, right? You were neighbors, so to speak, right? But Kropotkin says, no, this is fine. This is wonderful. This is everything we were working for. I love Lenin. I love Stalin, right? And he dies a happy man, right? Back in Moscow. And Goldman is one of his pallbearers at his funeral, right? It is the last open anarchist demonstration that will ever be permitted in Moscow for another 75 years. Until
Emma dies in Toronto, it says on Wikipedia.
I stand corrected, thank you. Yes, but you see again, safe, tolerant Canada. Before they brought in the Nazi war criminals from Ukraine, they brought him in the murderer of President McKinley, right? Right. If John Wilkes Booth had survived, which I haven't seen no evidence whatsoever that he does, but no doubt he would have ended up in Montreal too. As you have both have pointed out.
And his kids would have been rewarded Rhodes scholarships, I'm sure.
Well, look, Michael Ignatieff, as you pointed out to me, and on top of being Prime Minister of Canada and descendant of a police chief, he was also the favorite student of Isaiah Berlin.
You read that. Oh, that's so good. Yeah, that's right. He was.
No,
Yeah,
of course, exactly. Isn't that so cool? Exactly.
Yeah.
Anyway, but this wonderful question again, and bless you for it. TR conducts a devil's bargain with the Meiji Empire in Tokyo. He gets the guarantee of continued US control of the Philippines, which gives the United States and the American people absolutely nothing. The British at least had the interest and self-wit to plunder most of the world where there were riches to be gained. But the Philippines had nothing for America, no raw materials, nothing, right? But still, you got to have it. And what does he give in return? Why, Korea, of course. And Korea, the Empress of Korea is murdered in 1912 by the Japanese under the most barbaric of circumstances. And Korea is enslaved in the empire. Being Irish, there is an Irish perspective in this. The Japanese treat the Koreans not the way the British have treated the Irish, fitfully enlightened, fitfully vicious, but often just blundering, and more usually blundering and inept for the last 200 or 300 years, but the way they did under Queen Elizabeth I and Cromwell. In other words, genocidally, mercilessly, right? And this condition is applied in Korea for the Dark Age from 1912 to 1945 through both world wars. And there is silence in the world community upon this for two reasons. First, because Japan is still an ally of Great Britain against Germany in good standing through World War I. And second, because Teddy Roosevelt, that master of diplomacy, has concocted his devil's bargain with Japan. We move on to the 1920s. China is in upheaval. Sun attempts in his well-meaning, but I mean, I do not hold a high opinion of Sun Yat-sen. His idealism was, of course, exactly as you say, but I see him as like Francis Maduro was in Mexico, that most dangerous of people, a kind, honorable, idealistic, well-meaning twit who never had a chance in the first place. Right, and all he is used by darker forces to clear the decks, and then even more dark forces of chaos and evil coming after him. The first great Chinese revolution, of course, is started by Chiang Kai-shek, Jiang Jianxi, a dark and complex figure himself. He bloodily crushes the communists in 1927 in Shanghai. And by doing so murderously and ruthlessly, he has an enormous lasting effect on two people. One of them is the great French author and adventurer, André Malraux, who wrote what I regard one of the greatest books of the 20th century, Man's Fate, precisely on the crushing of the revolution in Shanghai. And Malraux, again, is another of these amazing people who's everywhere at every time, fights in the Spanish Civil War, fights on behalf of the Allies against the Nazis with de Gaulle, becomes de Gaulle's best bosom friend, and ends his life as Minister for Culture in Paris, and is responsible for cleaning all the great cathedrals of the world, because he's responsible as Minister for Culture for coming up with the new high-pressure hose technology that can clean medieval stonework without damaging it, which had never existed before. When I was a boy, even 19th century Victorian era buildings, everywhere you looked, from Montreal and New York to London and Paris, were covered in grime. Now, of course, everywhere you look, they're beautiful and clean, and this is thanks to Malraux. Right, and Malraux's bosom best friend in Shanghai, before he hooks up with de Gaulle, is an idealistic young Chinese socialist called Zhou Enlai, the right-hand man to Mao himself. You know, it's a small world if you move in certain circles. But the Japanese have changed. There is a new Japanese emperor who takes over, becomes crown prince in 1915 and takes over in either 1926 or 1922, I stand to be corrected. It's Hirohito, of course, the Showa reign. And the highly westernized, educated Hirohito, all his life, to his very ancient death when he's almost 90 years old, has busts in his study in the Imperial Palace in Tokyo all his life, and to all his many political incarnations of his two greatest heroes. And they are Napoleon Bonaparte and Darwin. In 1945, literally less than a week before General MacArthur lands in Japan, he adds a third bust to his two old favorites, though he doesn't get rid of them. The third bust is Abraham Lincoln, a man who does adapt to the times. But Hirohito is actually a trained scientific marine biologist of high repute. He publishes papers. He is also the reason that by 1941, Japan is the world's leader in biological warfare research. He is the guiding principle personally behind Unit 931 and the war crimes it carries out in China, that the Allies, of course, are not remotely interested in prosecuting after World War II, because the United States wants all that biological warfare technology itself to use against both China and Russia. As I said, it's a small world.
What is Unit 931?
Unit 931.
What is that?
It's the Japanese biological warfare unit that operated in China. They killed at least 1 million people, usually in the most barbaric of conditions. They deliberately practiced the spreading of plagues among the Chinese population in many cities.
Wow.
And they also carried out, decades before the Germans even began, biological experiments against prisoners on a massive scale. This has been well documented.
Yeah, I want to ask you so many questions, but I know people's times are limited, and I know your time is limited, and I feel like we do need to...
I feel like whenever I talk with you folks, I go into a time warp, you know, and I always have to pay for it in other ways afterwards, but it's lovely being here, you know?
Oh, no, absolutely. No, this is a joy. It's a really, really great joy. And I think everybody shares this. And the people who have had to leave already have written me messages expressing their gratitude for hosting you and just getting to experience this afternoon.
If I may make one more Darwinian connection.
Yeah.
And that is the best book I have ever read on Japan. And you literally become a marked man for life with the Japanese if you ever mention this to any official or influential Japanese. And it is even better than William Sherwood's The Decline and Fall of the Third Reich, which I think is a magnificent book, which has stood the test of time. And this is Japan's Imperial Conspiracy by David Bergamini. He goes deeper into the political mechanisms and motivations and chain of command for what happened in Nanjing and the Yangtze Valley in 1937, even than dear blessed sainted Iris Chang did or was able to do. And he was writing 30 years before she was. The amount of original research in this book is astonishing. There is a bibliography of 32 pages, and they're large pages in small print, of original sources, all in the Japanese. Basically, if Bergamini is right, then every Western historian on Japan, especially Beasley, is totally wrong. Now, of course, after World War II, Hirohito does give up almost all his real power. He has no choice in the matter. And I do not have a conspiracy or malign or hostile view towards the evolution of Japanese policy over the 60 years that followed. I do appallingly regret that under that idiot Abe, I mean, he's really the Teddy Roosevelt of Japan over the last 6 or 10 years. And of course, he reveres Teddy Roosevelt in all the ways that dangerous idiots would. And so, you know, he's put Japan back into a situation of confrontation with China where it should not be and should not have been. But that is another story. But the story of Hirohito from 1926 to 1945 is very clear, personally, and absolutely appalling. But when you read it, it's something that Anton has, and you, Matt, and you, Cynthia, have all, and you, Jim, that you've all found, and that I find in my work too, that when you dig into these things, it's like going through Alice's looking glass, or it's like taking the red pill in a perception in those wonderful Lawrence Fishburne movies. You know, everything becomes the opposite of what it was. Everything is the opposite of what you thought it was, you know? And that's just,
You know what? That's how you've lived your life, because you were educated in Oxford,
Yes.
of all places, and you are the wonderful person you are today. You're like really a jewel of the Nile. Like, you're such a unique person, and you brought this
Tell
up
my wife
like
and elder daughter
another
that my
lecture.
daughter has still not forgiven me for exposing her to Velikovsky at a teenage year. She said it took her too long to get him out of her system.
No, it's such a pleasure listening to you speak, and like your stamina, and you're just constantly creative. Like, it's really it's very inspirational. And as you made the joke, like you were having cognac or something with a friend in Washington, and they were like, how are you not a neoconservative with the upbringing you had? And you got all like upset, and then before you could answer, he was like, the Irish thing, isn't it? And you're like,
the friend in question, and you understand, one doesn't get paid much money as a reporter, especially if you actually take seriously truth once in a while. A very dangerous thing to do. You mustn't do that. And above all else, much worse still, as Jim will testify, is being curious and asking awkward questions. Never, never, never do that. You ought to have a seminar with Jim, and I'll happily follow up on him on what it means to tell the truth in the political culture of our Washington over the past 20 and 30 years. But the friend in question, so I name drop, right? And the friend in question you bring up, Cynthia, that you remember, bless you, was an eminent friend, and not really a friend at all, because we hardly see each other since, but we worked together very much for a couple of years on the plot to bring America into Iraq. And that was Seymour Hersh, the man who had exposed the non-massacre. Oh yeah, I can tell you lots of stories about Cy. He's a wonderful guy.
Oh my God.
Wow. And he's such a contradiction in terms, this left-wing Jewish Latvian intellectual, but he's also about 6'3" tall and built like a football linebacker. And his closest friends are all retired 3-star generals in the United States Army, because he was scarring in foxholes with them when they were young lieutenants in Vietnam. And that kind of, builds relationships with you, and this, this kind of thing. I mean, I built relationships of my own with improbable people. I was raised to regard Louis Farrakhan as an absolute monster, an anti-Semite, and this, that, and the other. And over the last couple of years, one of my closest friends and colleagues in working at in the Sputnik agency newsroom in Washington has been, I'll keep his anonymity in case it's embarrassing to him, but his first name is Barrington. And he's a wonderful, brilliant Jamaican journalist, a wonderful writer. I must ask him actually if he'd be interested in coming into these seminars too, because his career, he worked for many years as a senior editor for Louis Farrakhan, and went from that for about 10 years to the Washington Times. Wow. And nobody minded the fact that he had worked with the Washington Times. But although the Washington Times was not technically racist, the fact that you had a black man who wrote in such beautiful English and language that Hemingway could be jealous of him, as Barrington says to me, they were surprised I knew C came after A and B in the alphabet, So he and I shared our perspectives too, because, we've both been all over the political spectrum, not so much in what we thought, as just as in our experiences of the people we had met and observed. And sometimes these people are exactly the way you expect them to be. Mm-hmm. And other times, of course, they're completely different. Margaret Thatcher was exactly what you saw when you met her in person, which made her even more terrifying. And the frightening thing about her is she has a very narrow, rigid mind. English lower middle class. If you watch a British comedy sitcom, there are always characters in it who are exactly Margaret Thatcher, right? But she is also an Oxford-trained lawyer and a highly reputable and successful, even outstanding, food chemist. She did the crucial work in the 1950s to bring soft serve ice cream, which had been big in America for the previous 30 years. It had never been in Britain. And it only came to Britain because Margaret Thatcher did the crucial work to make sure it was adapted to the different food and drug standards and, British regulations or were at least then much tougher than Americans, I think still are, hopefully. At least they were under the European Union. But, you know, regulations against putting every kind of poisonous chemical and stuff. And Mrs. Thatcher basically helped make the happiness of my childhood because she brought soft serve ice cream into Britain, right? So you have this very narrow, but also very powerful mind. And she really believes in von Hayek, and she really believes in this liberalism stuff.
Yeah.
And she doesn't just believe in it as something to a moderate degree.
Mhm.
She again pushes it all the way.
Yeah.
And it's dangerous to get in her way, you know? People get clobbered when they got in Margaret Thatcher's way. Even the Russians they really were scared of her, you know?
And I would just say one thing into this mix before we sort of maybe tie a bow on this beautiful composition. But just to throw in something that I was thinking about is when you look at the rise of the Austrian school of von Mises and especially von Hayek's editions throughout the 1920s, you could see sort of a repackaging of that Kropotkin anarchistic view of just things self-organize and arise in themselves. We don't need government if you just let everybody individually have their personal freedom to do their thing.
You're right.
Yeah, it's just a repackaging of the exact same Darwinian outlook that's just given a new birth under the next generation, and that really takes off with the neocon post 1970s stuff that happens in that Thatcher then just totally and the fact that Dick Cheney and Rumsfeld and these guys were also these Trotskyites when they were in college, you know, they had this sort of stuff bubbling under the surface anyway.
Look, you're brilliant. That is so right. And if I can even add to that a little, you're so right. First of all, also it doesn't start with Darwin. Darwin is based on uniformitarianism in geology, and that is the basis of everything. And the man who gives us uniformitarianism in geology, I even have a mental block in his name.
Lyell.
Yes, Lyell, that's exactly the one, Charles Lyell. Lyell is crucial. Lyell was not a geologist. He was a lawyer.
Yeah.
With a terror of violent catastrophe. So he had to imagine the universe as peaceful.
Mm.
But it doesn't even start with Lyell, because Lyell is in the 1830s, and all of our perceptions of the universe, all of our perceptions of science, everything that Einstein comes out with, everything that Darwin comes out with, everything that Spencer comes out with, all goes back to Darwin, and Darwin is based on Lyell. But before Lyell, you have Adam Smith and David Ricardo. And Adam Smith is crucial to everything. And again, Jim will confirm with this. If you are in Washington today, you find that for Republicans and free marketeers in general, Adam Smith is God and the prophet of God, and so is Ricardo. Now, even the standard of intellectual teaching.
You mean the God of profit?
Yes, exactly. They don't even know Ricardo exists, most of them. The Ricardo was even more rigid and inflexible than Smith. And in my 2012 book, which actually, the one that was brought out by a mainstream publisher, then given a poisonous, non-existent title and sank without trace. But I have a huge section, I work overtime to discredit by name Thomas Friedman of the New York Times, of course, but ultimately I go back to Ricardo and Smith. And I find Ricardo an even more ridiculous and contemptible fellow. Ricardo was still active into the 1820s, right? So he only dies less than 5 years before George Stephenson creates the rocket, the first steam locomotive. Mm. And he only dies less than 15 years before Wheatstone in Britain and his counterpart in America, who I always forget, create the electric telegraph independently of each other. And another example of what I know you, Cynthia, and you might have brought out before, how, ideas can simultaneously come up, like Sheldrake's world mind concept, how the same idea bubbles up simultaneously among people who have never heard of each other on opposite sides of the world. It's extraordinary how often this happens. Right? But what happens is from the 1830s onwards, you have the internet. You have the modern speed of light economy that ties the entire world together. And of course, by 1860, as a result of this, you also have the first great international crime cartel. As I said before, the Zwei Dagan, the two towers the Jewish prostitution ring that sells 140,000 Jewish girls into slavery for the British Empire from 1860 to 1940, and is based in Buenos Aires. And the only work that was ever done on this was, first of all, done in the 19th century. The only effective crusading against it was done by, I bless them, idealistic, liberal, secular Jewish families from wealthy German family backgrounds in London and New York, right? And in modern times, the only serious scholarship that's being done is starting now in Israel, and it's being done by feminist scholars in Israel. And there's only a handful of them, but basically all the work on this was destroyed, a lot of them by Jewish religious sources. The Zionists were not involved in this at all. They fought against it. But the Orthodox rabbinate in Argentina and the stupid, ignorant old Orthodox rabbinate, which never accepted modern times in Poland and Russia, they were happy to let it go on. And because of the levels of anti-Semitism and suspicion of the authorities, the Austro-Hungarian authorities, who knew what was going on and fought it, but they were never able to penetrate it. And the Russian authorities were even worse. They didn't mean to be worse, they just didn't have a clue what was going on, because the level of hostility between Jews and Orthodox Christian Russians was mutually so great before the revolution. You could not penetrate that society. You could not penetrate that society. But this was the first great modern organized prostitution cartel in human trafficking. And it is made possible by the first NATO. It is made possible by Britain and France, as I discussed before here, going around the world, trying to destroy, very successfully, and destabilize the societies of Russia, China, India, Japan, because there was a penetration of Japan by the US in 1853, but Japan proved more resilient to it, as we know. The imposition of the emperor, the fraudulent emperor Franz Ferdinand in Mexico, which they would have got away with had America not won the Civil War, and had General Grant not maintained effective political control of the army, of the United States Army, after the assassination of President Lincoln. Lincoln and Grant were both totally opposed to the re-enslavement of the Mexican people by the French and the British. Mm-hmm. And this was one of the wars they won. This was another war they won.
Yeah. Martin?
Oh, and actually, one last, sorry, another levels of ignorance in Washington. I've found myself giving lectures to the US Air Force and Navy on the history, quite a lot over the last few years actually, on the history of the United States and Mexico. No, I am not an expert. I don't even speak Spanish, though my wife does. I am not an expert on the, I would have said I know very little about the history of the United States and Mexico. And that's correct, but that's the point. Nobody else in Imperial Washington knows anything at all, and it's always beneath their dignity to do so. They're all too busy masterminding the future happiness and eternal prosperity of Georgia, Eastern Ukraine, North Macedonia, bringing Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania into NATO, which George W. Bush, who comes from Texas, said was the highest possible national security priority of the United States. Now, what kind of idiot can you be to believe this nonsense? But it wasn't just Bush who believed it. People of theoretical IQs 60 points higher than him, which still isn't much higher than moron level, I grant you. But, you know, they believe it. This is modern America. Mm-hmm. I mean, forgive me, one last point. Our younger daughter, about 5 or 6 years ago, brilliant girl, got herself into the New School for Social Research in New York City, is doing very well now, working in the music and popular music industry as she wants to. But again, she went to a modern American school and college. So what should she, her parents, we come from Ireland, from Russia, from Ukraine, our background stem from. I went through Oxford. My wife has 2 degrees. We take our ethnicity and our background seriously. And our bright younger daughters, some question comes up about, you know, the concentrate, you know, who liberated the Nazi death camps in World War II and ended the Holocaust. And Rachel brightly says, oh, US Army, I guess. Well, of course, the Third Army got to Dachau and the Brits got to Bergen-Belsen. But it was the Reagan Army that got to the great murder centers and stopped them strung across Poland where the Nazis had put them. Right? It was the Red Army that cleared Majdanek and Auschwitz itself. And even our kids didn't know any of this because they grew up in modern Washington and modern America. So what could they know? But Matt, thank you. I mean, I don't want to take away the bow you tied. That's just brilliant because it comes back. Even catastrophism is seen as a reactionary force against international liberalism. International liberalism loves gradualness. It teaches that we have been here forever. Yeah. It teaches that global warming is evil, but global warming, even if it is real, is within our control. All we have to do is to abandon modern science and technology.
Well, you know, the World Economic Forum is saying that COVID-19 actually is not so bad because world carbon dioxide output has gone down by 7% since we shut down the world economy. So it's actually the pros outweigh the cons in this case.
Yes, of course they would. I mean, one last weird connection here. I was at the Washington Times for 13 years, a senior executive who actually protected me and nurtured my career during that time. A young, stunningly attractive lady, Josette Sheeran, original name Josette Shiner, had joined the Unification Church from a quite wealthy family in New Jersey, later left it. But later left the Washington Times too. Josette never looked back. She became Deputy Chief Trade Representative in the George W. Bush administration. And then she ran the Davos conference for another 6 or 7 years after that. And then she put in 5 years at the Food and Agricultural Organization and running that for the UN in Rome. Yeah. So again, there are people who have this magic touch or say the right things or go from one place to another. Now, Josette was no fool. I mean, people who thought she was didn't last long at the Washington Times. But she had this extraordinary gift for looking impressive at outfits that she had no experience of and couldn't possibly have anything about, but she knew how to operate at the political level. And there are people like that. You know, you can have a gift as most of us here have, and that's why we're all together, why we're talking. We have a gift for challenging the conventional wisdom and for nosing out political. The one thing I like Al Gore for, I loathe him for everything else, but that wonderful phrase, what is inconvenient facts? He really stole it from Charles Fort 100 years ago, the Book of the Damned. The term damned is specifically applied to facts that are damned because they do not fit into accepted modes of pre-existing belief in science as well as politics and theology, right? Charles Fort he's a Norwell for that. He's decades ahead of his time, right? But at the same token, there are people who just have a gift for going up in the world.
Yeah, the art of brown nosing. It's a strange thing to think about, but
yeah, I mean,
we're really good at it. You know, Schiller wrote a really wonderful drama called The Parasite, or The Art of Self-Advancement, which I highly recommend if anybody hasn't read it yet.
I haven't, thank you.
Oh yeah, I'll email you a link if I can find it online. It's such a good.
I'm taking it down now. That's great.
Short read.
Pardon? Who said that?
I'm just saying it's a short read.
Oh yeah, it's a fun little 1 hour read. It's so good. Martin, thank you so much.
Matt, the thanks are on my part, and to everyone here. Bless you all. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure and a joy. Scott, please give me a shout as well. And if Dave and Stephen are still on, not only my apologies, I will try and catch up with you sooner rather than later. I most definitely owe you that.
And I guess for those of us, Scott, you want to say something? Scott, go.
Please.
Well, I just on the global warming issue in the electric universe. I mean, there's a lot of I'm sure, Martin, you follow some of these things. There's a couple of great channels that they're doing great work on, but it just seems to me it's another aspect of an insight into what you say, you know, this Unitarianism versus sudden change or cataclysmism, whatever, that sudden changes, right? But the electric universe, we're getting more insight. In other words, we have leaps and bounds to understand these principles and how they affect the weather. And I think we're just, that's another aspect of it for us, because we really don't know, and that's why it's being exploited. But we have yet to, when we change perspective and the research is coming out of it, to make fundamental changes in our understanding of what makes the weather, what makes anything, you know, how things really work.
It's the Irish
applied that way too.
You know, one of the most revered figures in Irish culture is the Seanachie, the Gaelic storyteller. And of course, there's a lot of that in me. My father was a Cork man. You know, one of my grandfathers was an Irish peasant. The other was a lovable Jewish intellectual. And it comes together in very weird ways. But it is this. When the greatest of all electrical engineers who ever lived, Nikola Tesla, died in New York City in 1943, it is a matter of public record that the FBI confiscated all his papers. Now, according to the conventional wisdom, Tesla had been a crackpot and an idiot, at least for the last 40 years of his life, before he died at the very old age of 87. So if he was so worthless, first of all, why should the federal government of the United States bother to pick up its papers? And there was a dispute for many years with the government of Yugoslavia, because where they have set up, because Tesla originally came from those lands, he was both Croat and Serb. Well, the scientific papers were never returned to Belgrade, even though most others were. Now, if they were worthless, why? Right? Now, there are many conspiracy theories about this and popular myths and speculations. They may all be false. I don't need to go into any of those. What I just said is solid. It's a matter of record. And there is one other wonderful, hilarious coincidence, quote unquote. The papers were taken seriously enough to be sent to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology to be studied on behalf of the government by a prominent professor of engineering there. Does anyone else here know who that professor of engineering was and what his name was? I think you probably do, Scott. You want to say it?
It's a relative of Trump.
Yes.
Is his name James Trump or something?
Close enough. His uncle, John Trump, the brother of his father. The brother of his father.
That's amazing.
Now, that could be nothing. It's clear, because I delight in such coincidences, and they do happen in the world. But also, you know, maybe there's more to it than that. Seriously. But again, if Tesla was a joke and a crackpot, and he is 87 years old, right? When they didn't have the longevity tricks we actually take for granted today, like vitamins, supplements, you know, what have you. And Tesla actually was ahead of his time there too. I don't think he ever drank alcohol. He never smoked. I know that. You know, he was a crackpot food faddist for his day. But of course, while some of those things are still ridiculous, that he
did develop a gambling addiction, which his mother intervened on by saying, "Here, just take my last dollar and just go gamble." And he's like, "Wait,
no, that's quite wonderful.
I've been doing wrong."
I know he had a fanatical obsession with the number 3 all his life. I mean, he's a very entertaining fellow, but you know. I mean, he was right and Edison was wrong. The world does run an alternating current, which, if you think about it, is catastrophism versus uniformity. Uniformitarian current would have everything the same forever. But direct current, DC, isn't practical. It runs out of power after only a few miles or a few hundred yards even. Can't renew it. But when you keep flipping the electric field, as you have to do an alternating current, you can maintain the power of the current infinitely. Now, that to me is a metaphor for flexibility and changes and adaptability in culture and in our perceptions of the world, as well as a basic principle of science.
Yeah, which runs us right into the Ampere-Weber Gauss work on electrodynamics.
Yes, exactly.
And their work in transmitting through telegraphic wires using magnetic fields, you know, even before Samuel Morse information, which gave Weber insight into the structure of the atom and the electron's distance from the nucleus, which he was able to calculate 40 years before or 50 years before Planck. It's incredible. Yeah. Well, Martin, this is the last presentation before Christmas, and I mean, we live in interesting times right now. And
Debbie and Jim would both insist I clarify before American Christmas, before Western Christmas, as opposed to Orthodox Christmas.
Of course,
which will come on 11 days.
Either way, for both Orthodox and Western worlds,
yes, exactly.
People, I think, a wonderful gift.
We just put up our
keeps
tree
on
last
giving.
night. We're good.
Which are the best gifts. We keep on unpacking them and discovering something new every time we go back to them. So this is great. Martin, thank you so much. Next class is going to be on January 3rd. It'll be Nancy Spanis doing something on the frauds of the 1619 Project. It's a social engineering PSYOP that's being conducted right now to really undermine the United States.
I really look forward to that.
Yeah, that'll be fun. So that'll be January 3rd. We don't know the time yet. And yeah, let's just touch base and keep a correspondence. I think everyone has each other's email addresses, so we can keep dialogues going as much as possible.
Definitely.
Great.
I can say I'm wildly behind in at least 4, you included, of course.
I understand you're a busy man. And you don't want to see the list of unanswered emails that Cynthia and I have built up either. It's embarrassing.
Actually, I do. It would be very good therapy. I'd feel.
Oh well, okay, yeah. It's crazy. All right, guys. So have a great night. Thank you so much, Martin.
Thank you so much. God bless you all, folks. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks so much, Martin. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you. My great pleasure.